There are moments when faith collapses entirely, when the God you've trusted seems absent, the rules you've followed seem meaningless, and the world looks less like divine order and more like indifferent chaos. The book of Job exists for exactly that moment. It's the third book of biblical wisdom literature, and unlike the others, it doesn't offer practical guidance or philosophical observation. It walks directly into the darkest question faith can ask. In a minute, I'll show you how Job's story dismantles every comfortable answer religion offers about suffering. But here's what you need to know first. This is not a story about a man who suffers and learns a lesson. This is a story about a man who suffers, questions everything, and then encounters something that changes what faith means entirely. To grasp Job's significance, you have to understand what came before it. The book of Proverbs establishes a framework so clear, it almost feels mathematical. The righteous flourish like palm trees, it says. The wicked wither like cut flowers. Good behavior leads to blessing. Evil behavior leads to ruin. The world operates by justice, and that justice is orderly, comprehensible, and fair. God rewards what deserves reward and punishes what deserves punishment. It's a world that makes sense to anyone, rational enough to see it. Then Ecclesiastes arrives and whispers something darker. I have seen righteous people buried prematurely, the preacher says, and wicked people living long. I have watched the sun rise and set for decades, the wind blow in useless circles, and concluded that everything is ultimately meaningless. Ecclesiastes doesn't contradict Proverbs so much as it shadows it. The principles described in Proverbs might describe how the world should work, but they don't describe how the world actually does work. Suffering isn't always deserved. Success isn't always earned. Virtue isn't always rewarded. Now here's what most people miss. By the time a reader finishes Ecclesiastes, a question has been planted so deeply it can be extracted. If goodness doesn't guarantee blessing and wickedness doesn't guarantee ruin, then what about God's justice? Is God actually wise? Is he actually good? Or does the world operate according to forces beyond his power or beyond his care? The question doesn't arrive as an intellectual problem. It arrives as a wound, especially for anyone who has experienced loss that Proverbs cannot explain. Job is written as a direct answer to that wound. The opening establishes something crucial that most modern readers skip. Heaven itself opens briefly. God and Satan have a conversation that Job himself never hears. Satan makes a claim. Job is faithful only because being faithful has been profitable. Remove his wealth, his family, his health. Strip him until there's nothing left to gain from faith. Then you'll see who he really is. God permits what Satan proposes. Not because God is uncertain about Job's character. The text is explicit that Job is blameless and righteous, a man with integrity so complete that God himself vouches for it. Rather, God permits the suffering because something deeper needs to be revealed, something that only catastrophic loss can make visible. But the narrative doesn't explain what that something is. That silence is intentional. What follows is devastation without explanation. Job loses his children, his wealth, his livestock, his health. Everything he loves is stripped away in what appears to be coordinated destruction. And the text remains adamant. Job didn't deserve any of this. He's innocent. That's not a matter of interpretation or perspective. It's stated as fact within the text itself. Pay attention to this detail. Job's friends arrive. Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and they bring with them the only framework they possess. Proverbs. They observe Job's suffering, and they draw the only logical conclusion. Their doctrine permits. Job must have sinned, secretly, shamefully. Something hidden must account for this visible destruction. If you were truly righteous, they argue, God wouldn't crush you like this. The universe doesn't work that way. The cause must be internal to you. They're not intentionally cruel. They're being consistent with their theology. But they're also wrong, and the text forces readers to witness that wrongness for 34 chapters. Job refuses their diagnosis. I haven't done what you're accusing me of. He insists repeatedly. but the weight of unexplained suffering begins to fracture. Job's own faith. If he's innocent and God is just, what kind of God permits this? Job doesn't just defend himself against his friends' accusations. He begins accusing God directly. He calls God unjust. He calls God careless. He describes God as his enemy. This is the theological edge the book of Job walks deliberately. A righteous man in agony, innocent and aware of his innocence, openly accusing God of abandonment or malice. And the text doesn't rush to resolve that accusation with comfort or doctrine. The friends respond. Job responds again, and the dialogue spirals through chapter after chapter without resolution. No explanation arrives. No theology soothes the ache. Nothing resolves the tension. Instead, God finally speaks, and what he says subverts every expectation God doesn't explain. Job's suffering. He doesn't apologize. He doesn't construct logical arguments to justify his actions. Instead, he takes Job on a guided tour of creation's mysteries. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Have you walked along the springs of the sea? Have you entered the storehouses of snow? Have you seen the storehouses of hail? God speaks about light traveling in pathways. Job will never comprehend about the ocean, respecting boundaries. No human set, about wild animals, predators, creatures that serve no human purpose, that exist for reasons beyond human utility or understanding. The tone isn't gentle or reassuring. It's almost confrontational. Do you know? Do you have understanding? Are you wise enough to have grasped what I'm doing with this universe? This is where it gets profound. God doesn't answer Job's question. Instead, he answers a different question entirely. One Job didn't know he was asking. God shows himself not as a judge who needs to explain fairness, but as a mind so vast, so intricate, so engaged with complexity, at a scale humans barely perceive, that human fairness is too small a measure for his actions. Job's crisis wasn't a failure of faith. It was faith too small for the God he was encountering. The measure of righteousness Job brought to his suffering was real and valid, but it was a human measure, and God's wisdom operates on scales that dwarf human category. This is the part history overlooked. When Job hears God's speech, he doesn't continue arguing. He stops. I had heard of you by report, he says, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job never learns why he suffered. The narrative never explains it. The heavenly scene with Satan is never referenced again, as if that entire explanatory framework has been dissolved. But Job has experienced something, a direct encounter with the living God that rewires how he understands suffering, meaning, truth, and faithfulness. The book then offers restoration. God multiplies Job's wealth. His family is restored. He lives in peace, but the narrative is careful. This isn't a reward for passing a test. It's gift offered by a God so secure in his own character that he can extend grace without needing to justify anything. The restoration is texture, not transaction. It's the overflow of a presence, not the payment for performance. Now here's what shifts the entire picture. For centuries, Christian interpretation read Job's restoration as evidence that faithfulness eventually receives material reward, turning the ending back into Proverbs logic. But the text resists that reading. Job achieves restoration because he underwent something deeper than deserving it or earning it. He becomes the kind of person who can trust God, not for outcomes or explanations, but for presence, not for safety, but for witness. The restoration is what that kind of trust looks like when God chooses to extend it, but it's not what the transformation is built on. The historical context matters deeply here. The book of Job was likely composed during or after the Babylonian exile, a period when faithful Israelites experienced catastrophic suffering despite their covenant with God. The Proverbs framework had become unbearable. How could one explain loss on this scale? Cities destroyed, people enslaved, the temple razed, through simple moral cause and effect. If God was just and Israel was faithful, why had everything collapsed? Job addresses that directly. It says your suffering doesn't prove you're unfaithful. Your confusion doesn't prove God is absent. The world is stranger, more complex, and more mysterious than your doctrine can contain. And yet, paradoxically, God is trustworthy precisely because God is bigger than your understanding. Job's friends represent a temptation that persists today. When someone suffers, the impulse is to explain it, to locate cause, to restore moral order by uncovering hidden sin. It's offered from compassion and delivered as violence. It transforms a person's agony into evidence of their failure. Job's refusal of that framework, his insistence on his own integrity, is an act of spiritual courage that the text deliberately validated. But Job's own accusations against God represent another temptation, the demand that divinity conform to human standards of justice. If you're truly good, you should explain yourself. You should protect the innocent. You should operate by logic. I can follow what God offers instead is far stranger. A wisdom that outpaces comprehension. A justice that isn't identical to fairness. A presence that doesn't require justification through explanation. Pay attention to what this means for suffering that remains unexplained. The deepest teaching of Job emerges not in the restoration, but in the moment. Job stops demanding answers and becomes capable of encounter. He meets God directly, not God as described in theology, but God as presence, as mystery, as a mind engaged with complexity, so vast that a single human life is simultaneously infinitely precious to God and infinitely small within the scope of what God is managing. That paradox can't be resolved. It can only be inhabited. The final takeaways embedded throughout this narrative are these: Job's suffering carries no hidden moral purpose or redemptive logic. Innocence can coexist with agony. God's response reveals divine wisdom, operating at a scale that exceeds and transcends human fairness. Faith transforms when it moves beyond demanding explanation toward encountering presence itself. The book of Job was written for people sitting in dark rooms at midnight, asking questions that theology cannot touch. It's written for anyone who has felt the collapse of the framework they built to understand God. Read it again. Notice the moment Job stops arguing and begins listening. That's where the transformation occurs.